This episode of Two Lost Souls is brought to you in partnership with langbuddy.ai.
Therapy, as we know, is all about language. Words and their meaning help bridge that gap between us and our clients' understanding of the world.
However, like anything in life, practice makes progress. And if you're learning a new language, LangBuddy is just the tool for that. LangBuddy is an AI language bot that you can talk to on WhatsApp. And it's not just about speaking either. It's about listening and understanding. LangBuddy can send you voice notes so you can train your ear to your chosen language.
That's amazing. Is it available in French?
Oui.
Spanish?
Si.
Lithuanian?
Tape.
Japanese?
Hai.
Swahili?
Ndio. In fact, there are over 300 languages and regional dialects available, so we could carry on doing this all day.
Well, luckily, given that it's an AI chatbot, you literally can. There's no waiting for it while it sleeps or eats. The learning never stops. And given that therapy and learning go hand in hand, we are pleased to offer listeners of Two Lost Souls 10% off your first month of LangBuddy by going to langbuddy.ai and using the discount code Two Lost Souls at the checkout. That's langbuddy.ai with the discount code Two Lost Souls.
LangBuddy. Improve your language skills by chatting with an AI native speaker.
Hi, I'm Ravi.
And I'm Shell,
And you're listening to Two Lost Souls.
the podcast that guides you through the journey to becoming a CBT therapist.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this episode of Two Lost Souls. That's right, we are back, we are ready and raring to go. That's actually a lie. I'm feeling really tired right now, but that's okay because we're back on the show, and I'm really excited to be back talking to you today. As usual, my name is Ravi Amrith, and the title of today's episode is PWP to HICBT. And what we'll be talking about today is the journey and that transition from working at step 2 right through to step 3. As usual, I am joined in the therapy room today by the superb Michelle Sudbury. How are you doing, Michelle?
Hey, Rafi. I'm really good, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a while. You missed out on the last episode because you were feeling
No.
ill.
COVID got me again.
Oh no.
COVID
Again?
times 2. Yeah.
Gosh. Well, how are you feeling now?
Yeah, fine. All good now. Like you, very tired. Busy, innit?
It has been busy. Well, you've been undergoing many different sort of career changes in the meantime as well. How's all that stuff going?
It's going really well. Yeah, I'm making that move across to the new service. I'm leaving behind the old, sadly, but yeah, making that move. It feels like I've got like 19 full-time jobs at the moment, but I'm sure that'll get better soon.
That's because you do.
Yeah, well, nearly. Not quite. I've got quite a few, yeah.
And we are trying to cope with the loss of you from our service as well. So I'm trying not to feel very abandoned, but I'm really lucky that I get to still share this podcast with you. So that's something which is very cool.
Thank you.
So in today's episode, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be talking about the transition from being a PWP to HICBT worker or a step 3 high intensity CBT worker. And this episode is actually the result of lots of emails we have had in the inbox. So just to let you know that if you would like to request any content for us to cover on Two Lost Souls, drop us a line, reach out to us on Twitter at TLS_pod, or by emailing us at twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com. So, we've had several emails requesting an episode of this kind, and one such email is from Rebecca. And Rebecca says, I hope you're well. I'm loving the podcast. It's so interesting, insightful, and I'm learning so much, and I'm only on episode 4. I wonder if you could dedicate an episode or part of an episode to discussing the transition from being a PWP to CBT therapist. I recognise that you both weren't PWPs before, so this might not be possible, but I thought I would ask and you could let me know. Best wishes, Rebecca. So firstly, apologies to Rebecca and to everyone else in the inbox for my tardiness at replying to messages, but this is how you're finding out that we are doing an episode on transitioning from PWP to high intensity CBT by virtue of listening to it. We have the pleasure of being joined in the therapy room today by Gurpreet Shoker and Brendan Hever, who have both made the journey from being PWPs to training to be high-intensity therapists. Preet, first of all, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello. Great to be here. So I'm currently doing my high-intensity training. So I'm just over halfway through. I've got about 5 months left of my training. And before that, I was a PWP for about 3 years or so.
Okay, got you. Amazing. What about you, Brendan?
Yeah, hi, I'm Brendan. I am currently a high intensity CBT therapist. I've been a high intensity CBT therapist for 3 years. Prior to that, I was a PWP for 2 years. And prior to that, I was a mental health nurse for approximately 25 years. So great to be here. Thank you for asking me on.
No worries at all. So we've got lots of experience to draw upon here from both of you as well, which I think will be really helpful to answer some queries that we've received about that transition. And I suppose to start with, it would be good to start from the beginning actually and ask both of you, how did you find working as a PWP, and what were your reflections on working at a step 2 level with clients?
Yeah, step 2 was it was an interesting part of my career. Working at step 2, I'm always grateful for that period of time I had at step 2 because it provided my transition from being a mental health nurse to being a CBT therapist. And without that period of time at step 2, that would never have happened. I found the day-to-day work, I found it very, very challenging. Mainly because of the realities of life working in a frontline service on the NHS in a relatively deprived area in the West Midlands. And for a lot of the time, we were seeing people at step 2 who perhaps were maybe more like step 3 or step 2.5, which is perhaps a little bit higher level of need than perhaps the model was anticipated for. But we still only had sort of like 30-minute sessions, 6 to 8 sessions, 30 minutes, sometimes for quite complex problems. And that led to sort of like quite challenging working days, to be honest. It was very, very busy from the moment I sat down in the morning to the time when I kind of got to leave in the evening. I felt very, very busy like the whole time. Very little time. I don't know if you found this, Preet, but I found very little like processing time in the day to actually really think and reflect on when you're seeing people for such a short period of time and one after the other. It just left so little time, such little thinking time. So I got to admit, that was one of the toughest 2 years of my career. Ultimately, it was quite rewarding in many ways, but it was tough. I won't lie.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. The area that I worked in, I think it was very rare to come across someone who was pure step 2. We were working with a lot of people that were, like you said, Brendan, step 2.5 or above. And I think, for me, I think it was a little bit disheartening sometimes. Like we're only taught the basics at PWP, so a bit of the worry time or the thought challenging or and that kind of thing, or BA. And sometimes it felt like you were doing these things, but inside you knew that it wasn't enough, and like that person needs more. And I know we have the option to kind of step up, but sometimes when people kind of disengage from the service, maybe what we're doing at step 2 isn't enough, and then they just think, oh, it's not, I don't know, working for me. I think in theory, kind of it makes sense. You do a bit of step 2 work, and then if that doesn't work, you step up to step 3. But in reality, that wasn't always the case. It was like do a bit of step 2, discharge and consolidate. And I feel like for a lot of people that I worked with, it wasn't enough. So yeah, I kind of struggled with that. And in our service, it was 8 contacts a day. So, and trying to keep that in a half an hour session was really hard sometimes. Especially sometimes if someone would mention something, it's like you don't want to question it, you don't want to open that box because you just haven't got the time. So yeah, I really struggled trying to keep it contained.
I mean, that sounds like a real challenge, actually. So just thinking about that intensity of workload that you mentioned there, and alongside the intensity of workload, also working at that sort of stepped up level already as well. How did you both sort of cope with that at the time?
I kind of got into like, it probably sounds bad, but like robot mode where it was like, you've got to do what you got to do in that session and then move on to the next one. And that sounds horrible to say, and it obviously it wasn't nice when you want to give that bit more, but you're so restricted.
Yeah, it's often mentioned, isn't it, by people who've worked at step 2 that it can feel a little bit conveyor belty. I guess that's what I'm hearing. You know, we get a client in, they sit down, you've just started something with them before they're up and out again, and the next one's in. You haven't got that time for that. Even the interpersonal relationship stuff, you know, that therapeutic alliance, that must be really difficult to build at step 2.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's not a term I like, but it's one that I've heard before, the sausage factory model of mental health. And it can feel a little bit like that at step 2 at times. As Preet says, you know, if you've got 8 contacts at 30 minutes a time and you give yourself 15-minute intervals between those, that's 3 hours in the morning, 3 hours in the afternoon to give yourself a little bit of admin time. You literally you put you finish with one client, you quickly write up some notes, and then you're already oftentimes running a little bit late for the next client, or you just have to immediately get out of your chair and invite the next client in. And the amount of times I invite clients in, I was not truly prepared for those sessions because I just simply didn't have the time. And that is disheartening. I agree with you on that, Preet.
Yeah. I think as well with, I notice more, especially when it's face-to-face, it's really hard to keep it to half an hour, and it often overruns. And then, like I said, you're running late for the next one, and it just, it's just like
all the time.
I can imagine that. I mean, obviously we're talking about kind of the challenges of that environment in the workplace and kind of the logistics of sort of keeping to those time slots and the knock-on effects. But I can imagine even just as a person and knowing you both as being in this line of work of wanting to do your best and wanting to help people, I can imagine having quite huge impacts personally for both of you as well. And I'm just wondering how you coped with that.
With difficulty, if I'm honest, Ravi. For me, the role had a shelf life. I could not have done that for much longer than I did because of this reason. It's fairly persistent sort of professional frustration at not being able to do what Preet mentioned, being able to do that little bit more for the clients, just because there's a lack of time. And I guess as well, before we trained at step 3 as well, probably a lack of knowledge on certain things as well. I probably didn't have quite enough to help the clients that we were seeing. But when you don't have that like professional dopamine hit of seeing people get better often enough, then it can end up being disheartening, you know, for you as a practitioner, and you don't get the necessary simple principles of behavioural activation. If an activity is rewarding enough, you know, you keep on doing it. Simple. We're like mice in a maze. If an activity that we do time and time is met with a reward, it's enjoyable, and we carry on doing it. But by the time I finished it, 2 years, the rewards weren't enough. The stresses were not sort of counterbalanced by the rewards of seeing people get better often enough or substantially enough for me to have wanted to carry on, really. And that's why I made the transition to step 3.
I think something that you'd mentioned there, Brendan, was something that I really agree with as well. And I actually remember you saying this quite a while ago when you popped into one of our clinical skills back when I was a PWP, about that lack of training that you get as a PWP compared to what you do at high intensity. And being kind of halfway through my training, I can really see that, like the depth of knowledge that you build training as a high intensity compared to what you get as a PWP. You're not equipped for the role at all. And I think that makes it a lot harder as well.
I guess, I mean, that's really interesting. And it's definitely something I've heard a lot in my experience of supporting people making that move from PWP to high intensity. But I guess just for the sake of balance, I suppose in different services, maybe where the PWP role looks a little different, because a big part of the role that you do at step 2, it's around, community engagement, service promotion and development. It's a lot more varied, and unfortunately, there are many talking therapy services that haven't had the luxury of having staff to do that, simply based on staff numbers and demand, I guess. But I do know of lots of PWPs who make step 2 their career. It's a career pathway in its own right. And I guess just for people who are sitting on the cusp thinking, do I want to leave my PWP role? Do I want to go into high intensity, who might be listening to this? Kind of just wanted to say it's not like that everywhere. Do you think that's fair to say?
I personally didn't do a senior PWP role. I went from PWP to high intensity. But I have heard from other seniors who really loved that varied role. So, I mean, I suppose you can stay in the PWP role. There's nothing wrong with that. For some people, that might be, what they like, that fast-paced kind of environment. But yeah, someone that I remember speaking to who was a senior said that they liked that role and how varied it was, because you have obviously your clinical caseload, but then supervising other PWPs. And I think it's really common. I know, especially for me, even when I was doing my PWP training, I was like, yeah, I'm doing my 2 years and then I'm stepping up.
Yeah.
But it's like you said, but you can make a career out of just being a PWP. And we're not trying to I'm not trying to slam it or say that it's.
No, it doesn't sound like you are at all. Just, I
Yeah.
know exactly what you mean.
I guess it's personal choice, I guess.
Yeah, it is. And that environment that you work in, every talking therapy service runs slightly differently. And that can make a big difference to your experience, I think.
Yeah, I actually remember, now that you said that, when I was training as a PWP, and there was a few of us from obviously a lot of different services, and we work in quite a deprived area where there is a lot of trauma and a lot more kind of difficult things going on. Whereas another girl that I did my training with was from an area where that wasn't really the case. So the cases that she was getting were kind of pure step 2, and there was less pressure with the contacts and things, and she loved it. And I think that definitely does make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. It does. I think if you're working in a deprived area and you're working with greater complexity than was expected originally when the stepped care model was designed, and you've still got those expectations of contacts, I think that's where it can break down a little bit, and where staff staff well-being can sometimes be lost a little bit, because it really is hard to just relentlessly see that amount of people day after day after day after day if you're not seeing people who originally really thought of as being suitable for step 2 to work. So I think the model's fine, but I think it perhaps just needs to be adapted a little bit for the different areas where the service is set up.
Yeah, it sounds quite sad in a way, that it's almost like a therapist burnout that's the driving motivator to make a career move. Not always, but it kind of sounds like sometimes it gets to that point, just complete burnout after 2 years, and then needing to move on from that. It's really sad.
It was for me. That was the case for me. I knew by the time that I'd done my couple of years and was applying to go onto the high intensity course, I knew that I didn't want to stick with it for too much longer. I would have looked to it, if I didn't get on the course, I would have looked to maybe go back into mental health nursing, or take a different path.
I'm curious, actually. So, thinking about the experiences that that you both have gone on to have. So having either being on high intensity training at the moment or having had high intensity training, if you could go back in time, what advice would you have given to yourself sort of working at a step 2 level that you've learned since?
That is a good question.
I don't know if this answers the question, but for me, I kind of wish that I had a bit of the knowledge that I've got now than in terms of kind of the CBT knowledge that I've got from this training. Because I feel like it would have maybe helped a little bit more in my PWP role. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a really
Advice.
interesting point. I wonder, there's a marked difference, isn't there, between the training that happens at step 2 and the training that happens at step 3. And everything I've ever heard, everybody who's done the PWP course tells me it's much harder training year than at step 3, for a variety of reasons. But it makes you wonder, really, doesn't it? Is why don't we just teach everybody at step 3 level, but apply the skills in different ways? Because you're right, Preet, it's that extra knowledge that could make all the difference to somebody at step 2 doing a 6-session piece of work with somebody, but having all that extra knowledge, to somebody who's working at step 3 who has the luxury of longer sessions and can do a bit more intensive work. But the knowledge is still valuable, right? So why do we even bother teaching at step 2, I wonder? I don't know.
Well, I'm wondering actually, and acknowledging that we have had some conversations where we've heard that recruitment at the moment for step 3 programs is a bit of a struggle. I'm wondering if actually in the long run that's actually what's going to happen. Acknowledging that obviously talking therapies has had this massive rebrand recently as well. I'm wondering if that's the new vision that we're looking towards. But obviously there's a lot up in the air there at the moment, and a lot of discussions to be had. Just sort of thinking about some of the reasons why you'd go from low intensity to high intensity work as well. I'm curious. I mean, you mentioned earlier, Brendan, that some of it was stress is not really being counterbalanced by reward, and I was just wondering what other factors sort of influenced that decision.
One thing that training at step 2 and practicing at step 2 did really give for me, it just gave me for a thirst for more knowledge. I wanted to do what I was doing better. And so I learned some really good techniques at step 2, during my training, techniques that I use routinely now, even at step 3, exposure therapy, behavioral activation, and I often revert, especially when things get complex with clients at step 3 and things get hard, reverting to those simpler, I don't mean to talk these sort of like strategies down at all, but just reverting to these basics. I use them all the time, but learning those techniques and seeing them in practice and seeing them work gave me a thirst to know more, and then encountering obstacles for when it didn't work or how you needed to adapt it and what I could do if I had a little bit longer. It just gave me that thirst for knowledge. I wanted to learn how to do this better. So that was part of the issue for me, not just stress and burnout, but actually a desire. I want to learn how to do it. I know there's more to this. I just want to learn it. It was the seeking of that reward of knowledge and being able to apply that knowledge as well.
Right, got you. And what about you, Preet? Was there anything else that was sort of driving you to make that step as well?
I think I agree with what Brendan said there a little bit about that thirst for knowledge, and especially, thinking back to when I was doing assessments as a PWP, if someone with, for example, OCD came through, it's like, oh, I can't do anything with that, I have to step it up. So I guess it's that curiosity of, okay, how do you treat OCD? And I want to be able to, do those things. And for me, I think it was, just building my knowledge and being able to treat more and have more knowledge on treating things than I had at step 2.
I also want to add as well, I don't know if if it's not a factor for you or if you're just being dead polite, but money, right? You get more money at step 3. You get paid, much more handsomely, and you have much more scope for growth, I feel, in terms of things like EMDR training, being a clinical supervisor, which you could do at step 2, I think. Clinical lead roles, which you probably couldn't do from a PWP perspective. That's also a bit of a factor. It definitely was for me, making the leap from counsellor to high intensity. I wanted to develop and grow in that way. I wanted the financial recompense as well, if I'm being completely honest.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think for me as well, it just seemed to open up more doors, like you said, those different kind of extra career paths you can take. It gives you the option of maybe doing private work and things that you can't do as a PWP. So for me, it's, it opens up a lot more doors than what you get as a PWP.
The finances weren't really a motivation for me. I was a senior PWP, and when I qualified as a high intensity therapist, I went into the same grade initially at first, so it wasn't a big consideration for me. But yeah, the prospects of growth in the career and the different things that you could do, that was attractive.
Yeah.
And still is.
I think that's a really helpful point to help people out there listening weigh up whether, sort of the costs and benefits of that move as well. So for some people, you're right, being at a senior PWP level, it may not be worth that trade-off, but ultimately they might really be rewarded by an increase in knowledge, or people not at senior PWP level. The money might definitely be a motivator for them. So I think a really useful piece of information to cover there. How did you both find the transition from step 2 to step 3 work and the training process?
Hard. So you mentioned earlier that you've heard people saying that step 2 training is harder than step 3, but that wasn't my experience really. I found the step 3 training much more detailed, in depth and demanding, and a very tough year to get through, if I'm being completely honest. But I did find it very interesting. And that transition to the day-to-day work, I did find it sort of like really enjoyable, but I also felt quite exposed. When you're at step 2 and you reach the end of the line of what you can do with someone, you can always step them up to step 3. They disclose a trauma that's difficult, for you to work with at step 2. It's like, okay, you don't have to panic because you can step that person up to step 3. If treatment is difficult and not working out, you can always have the option of stepping up to step 3. But when you're at step 3, you're kind of, most of the time, that's the end of the road. Getting into step 4 and secondary care psychology service is not an easy sort of like path for clients to take. So that responsibility that you have, you don't always have the answers for it either. I found that very daunting at first and anxiety provoking at first. You don't have the answers for everything at step 3, and I guess I've just gotten used to that. It's still the case now, sort of like 3 years after qualifying, but I've kind of like got used to it and still somehow managed to find my way around and through therapy satisfactorily with most people, despite that challenge.
That's quite interesting because that's not something that I've thought too much about yet. I think being a trainee, I'm just like, supervisor, what do I do? And obviously we tend to work with simpler cases. So yeah, I guess I've got that to deal with once I qualify. But I think for me, in terms of the transition, the high intensity course is a lot more intense than the PWP. There's a lot more work. You do have to do that extra reading and put that extra work in. I'll be honest, the PWP training, I didn't do hardly any extra reading. I probably had one textbook for the course and that was it. So yeah, the high intensity, you do have to put the work in, but like Brendan said, you learn a lot more, and I do think I'm getting a lot more from this. Even just the group of people that I'm with, like the that makes a difference as well. You know, the people that I'm studying with now compared to as a PWP, it's a completely different dynamic. I'm not sure why that is, but I think that makes a big difference as well.
Thinking about that journey, and you've both spoken about, you know, using the journey, the training element of it to upskill and develop your knowledge in a variety of different areas. And I'm just wondering what pieces of step 2 knowledge or practice were sort of useful for you. I mean, I know earlier, Brendan, you mentioned sort of being able to sort of reflect and fall back on the basics when you needed them. What particular items do you think you were able to carry across? And I suppose likewise, were there any pieces of step 2 knowledge or practice that you were taking with you that you felt were actually unhelpful for the step 3 journey?
Ooh. I use step 2 stuff that I learned at step 2 all the time. Behavioral activation, activity diaries, activity scheduling, exposure therapy, hierarchies, graded hierarchies, the 4 conditions. Use this sort of stuff all of the time. I still find it really, really useful. I've got additional knowledge about all of those things now, and additional knowledge of how to adapt it and to make it work for people. But still, the basics I carry in my toolkit with me, and really appreciate having those. The one thing that you alluded to this earlier, Preet, about the anxiety at step 2 level. The main sort of like toolkit for, if your anxiety was not panic attacks or a phobia, then basically your treatment protocol involved worry time and a bit of relaxation. And that doesn't really cut the mustard all that much with the variety of anxiety disorders that we encounter at step 3. And that's where, you know, your formulation comes into things a lot more, and in order for you to be able to establish what might be useful for people. But it was just kind of like a one size fit all, sort of like for non-panicky stroke phobic anxiety, the worry time. And I rarely saw it used in a way that really helped keep people, get people, you know, living with their anxiety a little bit better.
Yeah, I definitely feel like at times it was all I was doing was worry time, because that's all there was, unless it was, like I said, a phobia or panic.
I'm wondering a little bit, having the extra time in sessions at step 3, and we spoke a little bit about developing that therapeutic relationship and, you know, having the warmth in the room, the compassion that maybe you don't have time for. Think about the kind of soft and gentle stuff that perhaps you haven't space for at step 2. How has that been? Has that been something that's been easy to bring into sessions for you, or did that take a little while to adjust to?
For me, like I said a little bit earlier, I mean, I suppose I always try to have, you know, you always try to, you know, show that compassion and things in your session. So I had that kind of at step 2.
Yeah.
But sometimes if a client would mention something, it's kind of like you don't want to dig any deeper because you haven't got the time, or you don't want to open up that kind of worms. So I think for me, at step 2, it was just about, okay, I've got half an hour, I've got to get through, you know, X, Y, and Z. And then from going from a half an hour session to having 15 minutes to an hour, I found that really difficult at first to kind of stop rushing through things. And especially, I know there's a big emphasis on it, the Socratic questioning and guided discovery and all of that. That was something that I really, really struggled with at first, because I'm so used to kind of not digging deeper and not asking those open questions and having to keep it, you know, quite closed and just get through what you need to for the session. I'm not going to lie, it's still something that I'm working on now. I'm slowly getting better, trying to, you know, to open up the sessions a little bit more. Hopefully I am anyway. But yeah, that was something that I really, really did struggle with. And I remember even talking to some of my colleagues that are on the training who were also PWPs. We were talking about things like the formulation, the 5 areas. And as a PWP, you'd be like, you know, you do the 5 areas and you'd be like, oh, can you see how it's all connected? But to actually take a step back and ask those more open questions, so what do you make of that and that kind of thing. That's something that really, I think I'm still trying to kind of get out of that a little bit.
For me, it helped that I got years of nursing experience behind me. The era that I trained in as a mental health nurse was very person-centered. And so the compassion, the open questions, the explorative style, that was that was always there. I was trained that way when I did my nurse training. And it was actually quite hard to leave that at the door when I was a PWP and be a little bit more directive, as Preet described. So I took to that aspect of step 3 work quite quickly.
Yeah.
And I was relieved to be able to do it again. Yeah. But I get what Preet is saying. It's you don't have, if your experience of delivering sort of therapy and treatments for people with mental health problems is just at step 2, then you are going to be conditioned into this like really quick fire way of working that doesn't leave a lot of space.
Yeah, and that, not being avoidant of, but not wanting to go there when there's a bit of emotion brought into the room, because that could be catastrophic, couldn't it?
Yeah.
The knock-on effects for the rest of your day and the clients that are waiting. And then we ask you as high intensity trainees to, make them sit with the emotion, right? Let's get in there and stay with it and feel comfortable and dig a little bit. So that must be quite difficult.
I loved that about the role, though.
Yeah. It's good, isn't it?
But it is good.
Yeah.
It is good. Those are the magic moments you crave for.
They are.
When you come into, at some point in all of our lives, we all decided we wanted to help people with this kind of stuff for whatever reason. And when you are in those moments where the emotion is high and learning is taking place and growth is taking place and you're part of it and you're there and you're feeling it and you're witnessing it, that's like the mouse in the in the maze, and it's kind of like it's raining rewards on you. It's like
it's raining dopamine.
It is like that's a lot of cheese for a mouse. And you don't get that at PWP quite as often. You do get it. People do get better at step 2 and they learn stuff from you that really makes sense to them. They go away and it can be life-changing for them. But it's often the case that, you have a sense of incompleteness. That's what I found at step 2. You could have done more.
But like you said, Brendan, there are cases where step 2 is enough. That is nice to see, I think, when you do have those moments where what you've done is enough. So it's always that it's not enough. For some people, like I said, just learning the basics is enough.
I'm curious, actually. So we've spoken there about the importance of that shift in affect in the room and sitting with it. And also just thinking as well, step 3 work is, I'm guessing, a bit more longitudinal as well. You've got the time to be able to almost track back someone's journey and figure out where a lot of their challenges might stem from, a lot of these seminal moments in their life that have shaped who they are and the beliefs that they hold as individuals. And knowing that, people deal with these things in different ways. So some people might be really up for the challenge and immediately throw themselves into it. Some people might be a little avoidant of that because it's a big shift to make. I'm curious as to how you found yourself dealing with that change and what advice you would give to people who were struggling to bridge that gap a little bit.
I managed that change okay. It made a lot of sense to me when I learned about longitudinal factors, when we learned about core beliefs in our training, when we learned about dysfunctional assumptions, rules for living. That really, really made a lot of sense to me. And I introduced it into my work with clients from quite an early stage. And now it forms the backbone of what I do. And 5 areas model is great. It has such great explanatory power. But if you are able to sit with your client and explain that what's happening in the here and now didn't just develop fully formed here in right now in 2023, there's a history to this, and explaining how early experiences model our core beliefs, or mold our core beliefs, sorry, and how those core beliefs influence the assumptions that we make and the rules that we develop for ourselves. That is often at a time where that's where those magic moments can often happen. More so in my experience than will happen in just with the simple 5 areas. That's where things really begin to start to make sense to the people who you work with. So I adapted to that sort of like quite well, and maybe was fortunate enough to have early on, even in my training, some sort of like really good moments where that really made sense for my clients, and they really kicked on from the knowledge that they gained from their own longitudinal formulation.
I think for me, the formulation stuff, at first, to be honest, I did struggle with it a little bit. I mean, it made sense, when you're doing the teaching and, you're at uni and stuff, and then putting it into practice is a little bit like, it's always a bit different, isn't it, from when you learn it to doing it in real life. And we were always taught, you do your assessment, you do a formulation, you need to have a strong formulation before you move on to the treatment. But for me, there was times where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm on like session 6 or 7 and I'm not doing anything yet. And I think that's the bit of the PWP in me a little bit that's like, come on, we need to be doing something. We're not doing anything yet. And there's been times when my supervisor's like, it's fine, like chill out. So yeah, I'm getting there, but yeah, it's a journey.
I've definitely noticed that, Preet, with people that I've supported from a supervisor perspective on training courses. It's often people who have worked as PWPs and then come onto the training who will be coming in at session 5 and 6 and saying, yeah, they're not better yet, I haven't done this, and we're not doing any work. But when you look at what has gone on in the room, there has been so much work happening, and it's really valuable stuff. It's that history taking, information gathering, understanding somebody's personal situation and how that's impacting. There's normally loads of maintenance stuff that's gone on, but trainees haven't been able to label that yet because they're not even quite sure that that's what they've just done. And yeah, there's this haste, isn't there? Like, I've got to get it done quickly. I suppose even when you qualify, dependent on the service you work with, there's still some of that because some services, we don't work to the session numbers we should be working to. And that can lead to a little bit of skipping over some of that really important groundwork, I feel. But we still have longer than you do at step 2. But I've seen that so much, I haven't done anything yet. And actually, really, let's have a look. You've done tons and tons. Yeah.
I definitely agree with that, and what you said about that sort of continuing even after qualification, that I think is a really important point. So I find actually even sometimes 3 or 4 sessions in with a client, I'm sitting there and I'm going, well, we haven't really we haven't made any change yet. But then I'm like, well, hang on, it's still really early on, and even then, we're taking the time to painstakingly put a really intricate puzzle together. And sometimes that's the really important stuff. If they haven't had the opportunity in their life to actually to put all these pieces down and take a step back and go, this is what everything is, even that in itself can be a hugely powerful moment for them. So even that is a really important piece of work and shouldn't be underestimated. I think so. I think that's definitely an important takeaway, an important reflection for me from that. I'm wondering actually. So we've spoken about some of the challenges, some of the carryovers from step 2 to step 3, some of the things that are different between working at those 2 levels. And I'm curious, just sort of thinking back to that time when you were about to embark on training, what were the worries or fears that you had?
I remember at the beginning being like, what am I going to do for an hour and 12, 16 sessions? What the hell am I going to do in all that time? I think there's always that, I mean, it still comes up now, am I like good enough to do this, or am I going to be helping them enough? And I think as well, the jump from working with more complex disorders, so things like OCD or even PTSD and things like that, that fear of, I don't know, screwing it up or that you're going to make someone worse. Yeah, that's still definitely something that's still there.
I was fearful that I would just never be as smart or as clever as the step 3 workers that were already in our service. It was just, whenever I went to them with a problem or asked for their advice on step 3 issues like PTSD or OCD, I was just like, wow, they just know so much and they just seem to know what's going on without you, almost like reading my mind. And I thought, am I ever going to get to the level that they're at? And I was worried, about that. And I don't know if I am at the level that I thought they were at or not. But I'm a lot more confident 3 years in than I was when I was doing my training.
I'm also really, really glad that you said that, Brendan, actually, because I've recently been added to a peer supervision group. Admittedly, the first time they added me to the peer supervision, I didn't say anything because I just wanted to suss it out. But my God, it scared the shit out of me. Just the fact that everyone knows so much and I'm sitting there completely silent going, I don't think I really have anything to offer here. Because I think in my mind, just before that supervision group, I thought, oh, it would just be like peer supervision groups at uni. You'll all listen to a recording or something and then you'll chip in your ideas. But it turns out it seems as though everyone's got their shit sorted, right? And so sometimes it feels really scary, particularly when you're sat in a room with people who've been doing this work for a long, long time and have got loads of miles under their belt.
I'm wondering about risk and how that's been for you at step 3. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Has it been any different, I guess? And the reason I'm asking is because we are moving into a kind of, I don't know, a new era of supporting clients with risk factors. We're moving away from traditional, psychometric support, helping us to make decisions about how we manage and support and even work with clients who might be presenting with risk. And I'm thinking your point earlier about at step 2, you've got somewhere else to go. How does that feel at step 3? Does it feel any different? Does it cause any anxieties? Does it just feel the same?
I think it's easier at step 3 than it is at step 2, to be quite honest. You have got more time to address risk. You have more time to address it in a different way, really. You've got fewer people on your caseload. You have fewer appointments each day. If you're seeing 8 people 5 days a week, that's 40 clients. That's much more chance of you encountering risk. You've got much less time in which to manage that risk as well. I used to feel a little bit anxious if risk came up and there was risk at step 2, because if it intruded too much into the 30 minutes session, then you start to think, well, how are you going to get everything? How are you actually going to improve that person's mental health to reduce the risk if you're using a third of your sessions or a quarter of your sessions risk managing? Whereas now you can have a much more organic conversation about risk. Tell me about these thoughts that you've been having. How bad are they? What kind of impact are they having on your day-to-day life? How close do you ever get to feeling like you might want to act on these thoughts? What would stop you from? It's a much more organic and natural conversation that often people are grateful to you for having, and you've got more time, you've got fewer clients, so you don't have to have that conversation quite as often. I think it's easier at step 3, to be honest.
I had not thought of that at all, and that time factor again, so important.
It is.
I suppose so far in my training journey, I've not come across anyone who's particularly risky. A lot of the cases are, flagged as suitable for trainees. So I suppose I've been fortunate in a way that I've not quite come across that. But I can see what you're saying, Brendan, with, having that time to explore things a little bit more, and a reduced caseload. And I think at step 2, it was something that we used to come across more, doing assessments. You're doing that telephone assessment, you don't know what you're going to get on the other end of the line. And then having that, like I said, that time pressure and having to manage that, but then knowing that you've got other appointments booked in. Yeah, step 2, I think it was definitely stressful, but in my experience so far, it's not something that I've really come across as of yet.
Earlier, Preet, you mentioned one of the worries about moving towards step 3 was, how am I going to fill an entire hour? But then Brendan's obviously mentioned there that actually that time can be a luxury. And I'm pretty sure, if Shell wanted to out me right now, she'd tell you that usually an hour for me isn't actually evenly enough to do all the work that I'd like to do with the client. So just to let you know now, and let anyone who's listening know out there, if you're worried about how you're going to fill an hour, you won't be holding that worry for long. In fact, actually make the most, particularly when you are getting the chance to work with clients who maybe are slightly less risky or slightly less complex in presentation. Savor that time, I think, as well, rather than feeling sort of rushed off your feet all the time. I suppose one question on behalf of everyone listening, if you could give any advice to PWPs who are hoping to go on the journey to become a high-intensity CBT therapist, what would those pieces of advice be?
My number one bit of advice would just be to slow down. Just slow down. Because it's come up repeatedly, sort of like over the course of this discussion. You've got to do so much at step 2 and do it so quickly. And it's so hard to slow down initially. So when you first start doing step 3, slow down, take your time.
I think for me, it's, I thought, I've done step 2, I've got that kind of basic knowledge of CBT. But then coming into, the more kind of in-depth formulations and things that we do, and I'll be honest, it was more difficult than I thought it was going to be. I thought, I think in our cohort, it was actually discussed that maybe people that were PWP before were at an advantage compared to people that had come from other professions. But I really think that it's not actually like that. And there are times where, even coming from a PWP background where you've got that little bit of knowledge, there was times where it didn't make sense for me, and it's taken time for it to click. And I think I'm getting to the point where things are starting to click a little bit more. And I'm just over halfway through my training. I've still got, a few months to go. So don't be disheartened if it's, more difficult than you think, or it takes a while to kind of get it. Just stick with it and it will come. I'm hoping it'll come together for me by the end of the year, but yeah.
I think those are great pieces of advice. And I suppose Shell as well, as someone who has supervised both PWPs and high intensity workers. And I'm curious actually as to whether you've supervised someone both before and after they have completed that journey. I'm just wondering if there's any pieces of advice that you wanted to add to that, anything that you've seen from a supervisory capacity that you think would be helpful for people to bear in mind.
Yes, I think one of the things I've noticed in most of the people that I've worked with and supported is the lack of confidence that kicks in quite early on. I think, you do feel quite de-skilled, I feel, at the beginning. I certainly imagined that I had a really great skill set that I was taking into my high intensity training, but actually, yeah, it's a whole new set of skills that you're learning. So the imposter syndrome as well, that lingers. I imagined it would just disappear once I qualified. I still feel it now. So don't wait for that to go, I guess. But do something to support yourself in building some confidence in your skill. If you're given good feedback, take it as read. Don't question it. Don't think people are saying things to be nice to you, because they're not. If you've done a good piece of work and you get a good piece of feedback, you deserve it. I think too often people are a little bit too humble and will, dismiss it as being, well, it's just what I should be doing. No, it's hard. It's a really hard year.
I think that's a really good piece of advice, and it's interesting actually. So recently, I've actually been having some CBT myself recently, and it's really interesting having CBT as a CBT therapist, because particularly when the CBT therapist knows you're a CBT therapist, well, they're like, well, I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs, right? You know exactly how these techniques work. But just in terms of operationalizing one of those things that you mentioned about, holding on to those pieces of good feedback that you get. Just one thing that came up in a discussion once was actually just writing them down on Post-it notes and just putting them like above your screen wherever you work, just so they're there and so you're reminded of them. Because I think you're right. Sometimes if you're not holding on to them, they can feel quite fleeting. And I think it's important to remind yourself of the good days that you've had and the skills that you do have, that you have worked really hard to develop. What I would like to say, firstly, is a big thank you to Preet and Brendan for coming on the show today. I was just wondering, actually, would you mind sticking around, because we've actually received an email with a few questions that I think it might be helpful to have your input on. So I was wondering if you'd be okay to stick around and help us answer those.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Amazing. Fantastic. So we will take a short break and we will be back with a little segment that we like to call Socratic Questions. Don't go away. So we've received this email from someone who has requested that they stay anonymous. And it says, "Hi, Ravi, Michelle, Preet and Brendan. I recently discovered your podcast and started listening to it. It's really great and so informative. For context, I'm a PWP with over 1 year's experience and thinking whether to apply for the September 2024 cohort or January 2025. Is it better to stay in my current IAPT service to do the high intensity training? If I applied to other services for high intensity training outside of my current IAPT service, does this look okay? And do all the universities delivering high intensity training have the same interview process? If not, what are some differences? Thank you." So if we, I suppose, break that down. So what about the first point about staying in the current IAPT service? What were your experiences with that, and what are your sort of recommendations?
I stayed in the same service that I worked at Step 2. I guess there are pros and cons, really. I guess as is the case to a lot of the answers that we give as CBT therapists, is it depends. If you work in a good service where you're well supported, where there is a good workplace culture, then I see no reason why you would benefit from leaving, unless you wanted just to have a little bit of variety, professional variety in your life, and just like test the water somewhere else. But if you didn't necessarily feel that you were in the right place for you at that moment in time, change. I suspect it might be quite easy to change. At the end of the day, sort of like if you're doing your high intensity training, there's a sum of money coming from somewhere else, like from training budgets provided by, I think, NHS England, ultimately, that your new employer basically gets a free member of staff. It doesn't come out of their payroll budget. So I think you'd be welcomed at other services. So I guess it just depends on what works for you, would be my advice.
So I was the same as Brendan. I stayed with the same service that I worked with at Step 2. And I think my reasons for that was I was comfortable where I was. The management were great. I actually told them that I wanted to, wanted to progress up to high intensity. They were really supportive of that. So I was really fortunate in that sense. But yeah, like I said, it depends. I know when I was a trainee PWP, my supervisor back then, she went on to do the high intensity, but she wanted to have that fresh start and go somewhere different. So yeah, I guess it just depends on.
I was just going to add, don't be afraid to ask questions. So, talk to your service and ask them what does it look like to be a trainee in this service? What can you offer me? What are your expectations of me on my training year? It's okay to ask those things so that you've got an idea in your head if that's going to fit in with your family, other commitments, because it's a really intensive year. There are some trusts that want you to be on site for your study time, for example. So they want you to be in base, studying at a desk and visible. There are other services that are really happy for you to take that time at home and use it however you want to use it, because we all study in different ways, right? There's no right way. So ask the questions and don't be afraid to do that. And I think actually if you're made to feel that you shouldn't be asking those questions, that's probably a really good indicator that maybe you want to look outside of your own service as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Because in my service, we have, well, I suppose with all training, you have 3 days in service and 2 days at university. But in my service, we get half a day study leave within those 3 days in the service. But I know of people who are on my cohort who don't get that half a day study leave. I really value that half a day study time. So I guess there's little things like that to consider as well, what that looks like. And in our service as well, we just do 1 day face-to-face work. Again, that can vary across other services. I know, again, someone else on my cohort where they've asked the trainees to come in every single day. They want them in the office. So yeah, I guess little things like that are worth considering as well.
I was about to say that as well. Actually, there was someone similar in my cohort, and I think it struck me as being quite interesting, actually, how some trusts and some services were basically saying, well, if you're a trainee, you have to come in every day, which I thought was quite interesting, actually. On that final question, does I suppose the interview and application process look the same for each university, or does it differ between each?
No, it does differ. Yeah, it is it's dependent on what the university themselves are looking for. There will typically be the academic test. That's pretty standardized, but again, that will look different dependent on the university that you apply to. Different services will interview in different ways. So sometimes you'll be part of a joint interview process, for example, where the university and the placement are together. You have that interview, you only have to sit that once. Whereas other places, it's a separate interview and then you do the whole process again with the service. So it's not very consistent. It's not very uniform across the country. But a service, if you inquire as to what their process looks like, they should be able to give you that information. And they also will have more knowledge about the universities that they've got places for. So again, they should be able to provide you with that information so you can make an informed decision about what's going to work for you.
Definitely. I think that's some really helpful advice there. And speaking of informed decisions as well, I think there's been some really good answers to all of your questions there. So thank you for writing into us with those questions. And a quick note to anyone else listening out there as well, if you have any questions about high intensity CBT training, if you have any questions about what life could look like after that, drop us an email at twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com or on Twitter at TLS_pod. Just to quickly say as well, a big thank you to Preet and Brendan for coming in today. What are your thoughts on what we've discussed today, and how are you feeling after your podcast experience today?
I was really nervous about doing the podcast, but I was like, I'm going to step out my comfort zone. And in true CBT style, I was like, I'm going to do this bit of a behavioral experiment. But I really hope it's been useful for everyone listening. So yeah, any questions that you have, hope that's maybe made things a little bit clearer if you are considering going on the high intensity journey. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed it. It's been fun. I'm happy to come back if you'd have me back.
I've really enjoyed it too, and it's great to have that opportunity just to reflect where I've come from, those step 2 days, and think a little bit more about step 2 life. You get kind of like, your attention focuses on the day to day of your own working life in the here and now, doesn't it? When you're working in frontline mental health, whatever your role is. So it's been great to have that opportunity just to reflect on this change that I've made myself, and it's been good for me to do that. So yeah, thanks for having me on as well. Been a pleasure.
No worries at all. Thank you, both of you, so much for coming, and definitely we'll have you both back if you're up for it. I'm sure that our inbox is going to be full of more questions as well about that PWP journey, because I think it can be quite a nerve-wracking move for some people. And I again, if anyone has any questions, send them in, and if you're both happy to come back at some point, we'd love to have you back if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Of course.
Amazing, fantastic. Well, thank you again for sharing what you have today, and we look forward to having you back.
Cheers.
Thank you.
So, Shell, I really enjoyed that. What did you make of that conversation?
It was great. It was really good. And what I think what I enjoyed the most was I've never been a PWP. Can't talk about that part of the experience because it's not my experience. So I just found it really interesting. And as guests, how engaging. They were brilliant.
Totally, definitely, and similarly, actually, it had me reflecting on my practice, actually, and I thought it was really interesting. I know we've done an episode in the past on sort of self-care and looking after yourself as a therapist, and I remember sort of asking a question in that episode about sort of signs and symptoms of burnout that someone might see or experience, and I found it really interesting that actually, just thinking about the way people would have to work as a PWP in terms of, very limited opportunity to ask Socratic questions, really limited opportunity to sort of open particular boxes for fear that you'd kind of go over that half an hour limit. I find that actually that taught me that if I start to get burnt out, that's the start of that's the sort of thing I start to notice in myself and my practice at step 3, really interestingly. So I think it was really useful to reflect on that, but also reflect on, I suppose, some of the blind spots I have from not coming from that world and not having the knowledge that a PWP would have, and also made me appreciate as well that I think courses and particularly the course I was on, they're looking to develop quite a diverse range of students. So having PWPs on a course, non-PWPs, people from lots of different backgrounds, and appreciating that level of existing knowledge and that existing knowledge as a whole kind of comes in different flavors. And it's not that one is better than the other, it's just that we all learn different things, and generally when we work as a team really well, we get to combine those bits of knowledge and integrate it into some pretty cool practice. So I took that away from it, which I thought, a big thank you once again to Rebecca for sending in the email that inspired that episode, alongside lots of other emails that we've had as well. Please continue to email us if you've got any questions or any ideas that you would like us to explore on the podcast. The email address, as usual, is twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us on Twitter at @TLS_pod.
I just wanted to say thank you to Anne-Marie, who sent me a message on Twitter asking when the podcast would be back. She mentioned that she was finding it really interesting and helpful. So I'm sorry that we were away for such a long time. It's my fault entirely. Been moving jobs and it's been a bit busy, but I'm really hopeful that we're going to be a bit more consistent now. Ravi? Yeah.
Fingers crossed. So, admittedly, it's not just Shell's fault that we've taken a bit of a break. We've both kind of had a lot of stuff going on, actually, and life sort of happens, and sometimes certain things have to take a back seat. But that being said, it's really nice to be gathered again for an episode like this, and I really enjoyed today's episode, so hopefully we'll be able to convene again, and thank you all for sending in your messages of support as well. And it really means a lot to us to know that this show is meaningful for you, and is helpful for you, so a big thank you for that. All that's left to say is a big thank you to Preet and to Brendan for joining us for today and for sharing their knowledge, time and expertise with us. We found that really helpful. Also, a big thank you to you, Shell.
Thanks, Ravi.
And also a big thank you to all of you out there listening, and we will catch you next time on Two Lost Souls. Two Lost Souls was presented by Ravi Amrath and Michelle Sudbury. To get in touch, contact TLS_pod on Twitter or email twolostsoulspodcast@gmail.com.